Welcome to Last Pride channel. On this occasion, I will discuss about what a processor is, what a basic element of processor is, and about 4 primary functions of processor. So stay tuned on this channel. A processor or CPU is the logic circuitry that responds to and processes the basic instructions that drive a computer. The CPU is seen as the main and most crucial integrated circuitry (IC) chip in a computer, as it is responsible for interpreting most of computer's commands. CPUs will perform most basic arithmetic, logic, and I/O operations, as well as allocate commands for other chips and components running in a computer. The term processor is used interchangeably with the term central processing unit or CPU, although strictly speaking, the CPU is not the only processor in a computer. The GPU or called graphics processing unit is the most notable example, but the hard drive and other devices within a computer also perform some processing independently. Nevertheless, the term processor is generally understood to mean the CPU. Processors can be found in PCs, smartphones, tablets, and other computers. The 2 main competitors in the processor market are Intel and AMD. The basic elements of a processor include 1. The arithmetic logic unit or it can be shortened by ALU, which carries out arithmetic and logic operations on the operands in instructions. So next is the floating point unit, FPU, also known as a math coprocessor or numeric coprocessor, a specialized coprocessor that manipulates numbers more quickly than the basic microprocessor circuitry can. The next element is registers, which hold instructions and other data. Registers supply operands to the ALU and store the results of operations. And the last is L1 and L2 cache memory. Their inclusion in the CPU saves time compared to having to get data from random access memory or we can call RAM. The 4 primary functions of a processor are fetch, decode, execute, and write back. The first is fetch is the operation which receives instructions from program memory from a system's RAM. The second is decode is where the instruction is converted to understand which other parts of the CPU are needed to continue the operation. This is performed by the instruction decoder. Third is execute is where the operation is performed. Each part of the CPU that is needed is activated to carry out the instructions. The main components of a CPU are the ALU, registers and control unit. The basic functions of the ALU and register are labeled in the above basic elements of a processor section. The control unit is what operates the fetching and execution of instructions. The processor in a personal computer or embedded in small devices is often called a microprocessor. That term means that the processor's elements are contained in a single IC chip. Some computers will operate using a multi-core processor, a chip containing more than one CPU. A CPU is typically a small device with pins on it facing down in a motherboard. CPUs can also be attached to a motherboard with a heat sink and a fan to dissipate heat. Most processors today are multi-core, which means that the IC contains 2 or more processors for enhanced performance, reduced power consumption and more efficient simultaneous processing of multiple tasks. Multi-core setups are similar to having multiple, separate processors installed in the same computer, but because the processors are actually plugged into the same socket, the connection between them is faster. Most computers may have up to 24 cores, however, this number can increase up to 12 cores, for example. If a CPU can only process a single set of instructions at one time, then it is considered as a single-core processor. If a CPU can process two sets of instructions at a time, it is called a dual-core processor. 4 sets would be considered a quad-core processor. The more cores, the more instructions at a time a computer can handle. Some processors use multithreading, which uses virtualized processor cores. Virtualized processor cores are called VCPUs. These are not as powerful as physical cores but can be used to improve performance in virtual machines, VMS. However,